When anonymous knowledge keepers are mistaken, should we keep believing them? From truth comes reconciliation. Every living child matters most of all. Is Canada a genocidal nation? Mass graves made world headlines. Horrible history. Mass grave of Indigenous children reported in Canada. How thousands of Indigenous children vanished in Canada. Canada, 751 unmarked graves found at residential school. Where did these claims originate? The former Kamloops Indian Residential School reported that 215 graves and remains of children had been found. According to Global News and this video press conference, Robin Gill of Global News asked, given the school is very old, given the fact that record keeping may not be accurate, how difficult is it going to be to actually identify should there actually be remains in those graves? Don Worm, legal counsel for the Kamloops band, said, well, I think what we can say firstly is that it's undeniable that those are graves. There's no question that there have been children gone missing. Our knowledge keepers from this community have told us so. We believe them. That was in July 15th, 2021. Rule of law. Since the Magna Carta of 1215, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the principles of a fair trial have required that the accused be considered innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, that evidence be presented to justify the accusation, that the accuser must face the accused in court with few exceptions. In the case of Canada and the mass graves, the principles of a fair trial have been abandoned by the media and public at large. Canada, the accused, is considered to be guilty. Devoted priests, nuns, and even residential school Indigenous staff have been slandered. Dozens of churches burned and vandalized. Catholic hate crimes are up 260% in Canada. The only evidence is ground-penetrating radar, GPR, scans of old graveyards and the claims of knowledge keepers. All the knowledge keepers are anonymous and relying on memories from when they were children. As well as being the educational choice for the children of the elite of Indigenous communities, Indian residential schools gave shelter and a future to thousands of orphans and the children from destitute or dysfunctional homes. Many students have warm memories and found rewarding careers thanks to the education. One example is Chief Dan George. And here we see Father Noonan at Kamloops Indian Residential School. He was one of the former Oblate principals at the Kamloops Indian Residential School reunion in 1977. So why would people claim children are missing? One need only read this sad story in Eric Bay's book, Indian Residential Schools, Another Picture. Bays explains that at the Hudson's Bay Trading Post at Albany, a father showed up saying there was no food in the family tent and that his wife was ill. The father then died. The Hudson Bay sent out men with food only to find the family in a tent, the mother deceased with 5 children around her. A 2-month-old baby was given up to a relative. The 16-year-old joined other relatives on a hunt, and the remaining 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, came to the residential school. During a flu epidemic, the youngest of the 3 died at the school. This vignette is a repeating story through the history of Indian residential schools. orphaned children, families in distress. This is also an example of why many Indigenous people know there are missing children from their communities, and while they feel certain that the loss is directly associated with Indian residential schools. Survivors and anonymous knowledge keepers have made sweeping claims. Even some scientists believe hearsay evidence. Before the first electromagnetic waves from any radar device surveying a suspected residential school gravesite penetrate the earth, the ground, archaeologists have likely already gathered key information from one of their most important sources, survivors. Survivors will either have heard stories over the years or have direct knowledge of the site itself, said Terence Clark, an assistant professor of archaeology at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. We've heard that often children would be the ones digging the graves for other children, and so they might know exactly where the graves are, he said. It's not realistic to do hundreds of meters around schools in every direction. It's kind of a needle in a haystack. But if we talk to survivors that know specific information, then we can certainly narrow down our search. But there is no list of missing children, no missing persons reports. 150,000 students over 113 years. Parents voluntarily enrolled their children in residential schools by making a signed application for admission. If their child did not come home, would they and the band not have noticed and complained? The evidence of graves and missing children is often based on ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. But GPR can only detect subsurface anomalies. It cannot see graves, coffins, or bodies. Document research and simple math would show that of the 150,000 Indian residential school students, as estimated by the government, 103,203 of them were still alive in 2007. This means 69% of the students who attended an Indian residential school institution over a period of 113 years were still alive 124 years after the first government-funded schools were established. Thus, the claim of genocide is false. Examples of lack of basic research: Pine Creek, Shubenacadie, Charles Camsell Hospital, Gruard, McGill University, Stolo Nation. Pine Creek. On May 11, 2022, Chief Derek Nepinak announced that a GPR search had begun at the former Pine Creek Indian Residential School based on community members' claims of missing children. We feel that the truth of our community has to be identified, and it has to be told by us, by our own people, Nepinak said. One community member, Jennifer Rocchio, said her grandmother, Dorothy Nepinak, claimed 11-year-old Thomas Nepinak died when he was detained in a punishment area after a fight at the school and did not return home. Memories. Jennifer Rocchio, a member of the Pine Creek First Nation who lives in St. Anne, Manitoba, said her grandmother attended the residential school with some of her siblings, one of whom did not return home. His name is Thomas and he was 11, she said. He never came home from residential school, so everyone is looking forward to hopefully getting his remains so they can do a proper burial for him. Rocchio said Thomas had gotten into an altercation with students at the school, and instead of being taken to a nurse after getting hurt, he was brought to a punishment area and died a couple of days later. Memories versus evidence. Chief Derek Nepinak could have obtained a copy of Thomas Nepinak's Manitoba death certificate prior to allowing Jennifer Rocchio's erroneous account to be reported by the CBC, but he didn't do that. Had he done so, Chief Nepinak would have seen that the death certificate was signed by Thomas Nepinak's uncle, Jerome Nepinak, whose son, Valentin Nepinak, was boys' supervisor and athletic instructor at the Pine Creek Indian Residential School in 1957. See the school newsletter, in which many members of the Nepinak family are mentioned, as well as other Indigenous staff. Instead of being guided by school quarterly returns, Manitoba death certificates, and school newsletters, Chief Nepinak went ahead with a GPR search and claimed that GPR had detected 14 burials in the basement of the historic Our Lady of Sorrows Church near the school. A year-long RCMP investigation ensued. A subsequent year-long RCMP investigation found no evidence of any criminal activity connected to the GPR results, but despite the RCMP report, Chief Nepinak brought in a team of archaeological experts to excavate the church basement. The excavation turned up no human remains. The media fanfare with which Chief Nepinak had announced the GPR search and the excavation of the church basement was noticeably absent from the chief's disgruntled announcement in a Facebook video that no murdered and secretly buried children had been found. Nor did Chief Nepinak admit that the memories of Jennifer Rocchio and other community members, which had prompted the GPR search and the excavation of the church basement, were obviously faulty and should not have been believed. Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. In August 2021, an excavation at the former Shubenacadie Indian Residential School turned up no clandestinely buried residential school children. A statement from the First Nation Wednesday said that the crews did find evidence of unmarked graves. Those graves predate the period of the residential school by about 100 years and are connected to former landowners. Chief Mike Sachs said that he had mixed emotions about the results of the search. On the one hand, I was very grateful that no children were recovered. And on the other hand, I feel there's something somewhere, because a lot of our community members that are survivors are certain that people did go missing, that there are people there, somewhere. Once again, although anonymous community members were certain that people did go missing, they were clearly mistaken and should not have been believed. Charles Camsell Hospital. In October 2021, an expensive excavation at the former Charles Camsell Hospital in Edmonton turned up nothing. Chief Calvin Bruno of the Papachase First Nation said he has mixed feelings about the results. He said there are lingering concerns given all the accounts of people being buried at the site. Again, the faulty memories of community members should not have been believed. Gruard. In 2022, Keisha Supranant announced that based on locations identified by anonymous survivors and elders, she had found 54 unmarked graves outside the boundaries of the community cemetery at Gruard. Keisha Supranant, project lead and director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta, said the discovery supports what survivors and elders had been saying. Searchers focused on a small parcel of land around the school, also called St. Bernard's Indian Residential School. 54 potential graves were located by the church, a former nun's residence, and by an old root cellar. Subsequently, a second GPR survey was done by Tetra Tech using more sophisticated technology. In early July of this year, the results were released to the band, but not to the media. Tetra Tech had found no verifiable unmarked graves outside the community cemetery. In other words, the alleged 54 unmarked graves found in 2022 by Keisha Supernant near the church, the nun's residence, and an old root cellar were GPR phantoms and the memories of anonymous survivors and elders who had directed her to these alleged burial sites were faulty and should not have been believed. McGill University. Last October, in a lawsuit in the Quebec Superior Court in which Don Worm was involved, the Mohawk mothers claimed there were unmarked graves at the former Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal and obtained a temporary injunction against McGill University to stop the renovation and excavation of the site. You've never seen a case like this because there hasn't been one. And frankly, the fact that Indigenous people can get justice in a courtroom it just goes to prove that we're not completely shut out. But it does take extraordinary measures, said lawyer Don Worm, who, along with lawyer Julian Falconer, were present at the hearing as legal counsel for Kimberly R. Murray, the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Traditional custodians of the land. Calling themselves traditional custodians of the land, they presented their evidence before the court, including testimony from MK Ultra psychological experiment survivor Lana Ponting, who said she had seen Indigenous children at the hospital when she was there and witnessed clandestine grave digging in her affidavit. In addition to GPR, cadaver dogs were used in an attempt to detect human remains. Each dog gave a signal near a stretch of wall near the Hersey Pavilion, which used to be the nurses' dorm. However, when the area near the wall was excavated, nothing was found. The unverified claims by anonymous persons of unmarked graves should not have been believed. Stolo Nation. On the 21st of September 2023, the Stolo Nation, a political amalgamation of 11 communities stretching through the entire Fraser Valley and beyond, announced that it had found yet more unverified GPR soil disturbances. The Stolo Nation in BC's Fraser Valley says its probe into missing children and unmarked burials has so far identified, with certainty, 158 children who died at or because of their attendance at 3 former residential school sites and 1 former hospital. Preliminary findings from ground-penetrating radar also suggest numerous anomalies that could be unmarked graves at St. Mary's Residential School in Mission, according to the nation's research team. No residential school was on these reserves. Not only did these 11 communities not have a residential school on any of their reserves, but they have expanded the scope of their searches to include All Hallows in Yale, a school for white and Indigenous female students, which was not part of the 2006 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, as well as the Coqualitza Indian Hospital for adult and child TB patients, where it's obviously unsurprising that deaths occurred and have apparently ignored, amongst God's own, the enduring legacy of St. Mary's Mission by journalist Terry Glavin and former students of St. Mary's Indian Residential School in Mission. Horror stories by anonymous survivors. Again, horror stories by anonymous survivors with faulty memories are featured in the Stolo press release, but not one scrap of verified evidence, as has been the case with every other band announcement since the Kamloops band's false claim on the 27th of May 2021 that the remains of 250 children had been found. Outrageous tales told by survivors mentioned in the Stolo press release include the following. Koshenko said that the research team had heard cases of children being burned, being killed, secretive burials of children and babies, furnaces being used to cremate bodies, and children being forced to bury other children. The team also heard stories and found evidence of children being intentionally infected with tuberculosis and other disease as punishment, being forced to eat moldy food, and forced labor, she said. Heartfelt knowledge does not match evidence. One story included firefighters responding to a fire at the St. Mary Girls' Dormitory, finding the remains of fetuses in the walls, added Kostashenko. The devastating findings confirm what residential school survivors and community members have long known, said Jimmy and Kelly. We know, in here, that some of those children never made it home, he added, pointing to his heart. In summary, there's a pattern here. Stories told by elderly people with faulty memories are unquestioningly accepted and widely publicized by bands and by the legacy media. The names of these people are not revealed to the media or the public and are known only to some band members. GPR searches, funded by the federal government with no requirements of accountability or transparency, are undertaken on the basis of the vague and unsupported statements made by these anonymous persons. But the GPR reports paid for by Canadian taxpayers are never released to the media or the public, with the result that the media and the general public cannot independently verify whether anything has actually been found. GPR seldom followed by excavation. The GPR results are seldom followed up by excavation. Kamloops has not been excavated more than 2 years after the false claim that the remains of 215 children had been discovered. But when excavations do take place, nothing is found. No human remains, no clandestinely buried children, no murdered children, no missing children. In other words, the knowledge keepers, survivors, elders, and community members should not have been unquestioningly believed. Federal money for GPR searches. Nonetheless, the same scenario continues to be repeated by other bands across the country because federal government money is always available to pay for the GPR searches. The federal government is unwilling to accept that stories told by anonymous, elderly knowledge keepers, survivors, elders, and community members with failing and faulty memories simply have no basis in reality. And as a result, the federal government encourages this dysfunctional process to continue by keeping the funds for GPR searches flowing. This has to stop. It's tearing Indigenous communities apart. Community members are traumatized and anguished by the ambiguous GPR results and re-traumatized and confused when excavations take place and nothing is found. Moreover, these false claims of murdered and missing children are irreparably damaging Canada's reputation throughout the world, particularly since foreign news outlets are increasingly calling the claims a hoax. Mass public panic versus facts and archival evidence. Example, Martinsville satanic panic, which swept Saskatchewan in the 1990s. As American psychologist David Raskin testified in that case, all it takes is a little prompting and repeated leading interviews, and people can remarkably remember all kinds of things that never happened. Elders were children then. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. Undue pressure on elders is unfair. Many people have dreams of land back as the goal and reparations for the alleged genocide. Yet historical records and evidence do not support this claim. Rather than searching for graves, we should all be reaching out to our living children who hold the future of the world in their hands. When anonymous knowledge keepers are mistaken, should we keep believing them? From truth comes reconciliation. Every living child matters most of all.